All right, it's time to get back into the prophet Hosea. This time we'll be in chapter 11. We'll be kicking it off, but we won't go all the way through it. I think there is just so much in Hosea 11 that we will do good to stick to these opening verses and not try to cram everything into one recording. So the first thing I'll do is I'd like to read Hosea 11, 1 and 2. And then I'm going to follow that up with a reading of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, or at least most of it. So not a lot of reading from Hosea, but then we are going to get some from Matthew. Hosea chapter 11, verses 1 and 2 sounds like this. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. And I do want to read Matthew chapter 2, the majority of it, because it connects itself to what we just read in Hosea 11. It says this, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and this is from Micah 5:2, You, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. Well, there are many things you could say about Matthew 2, and that definitely deserves its own look, its own study, its own consideration. I'm still blown away by the fact that guys who are supposedly wise men come up to someone who is currently a king and say, hey, we heard there's a new king, where can we find him? I mean, that was just guaranteed to set him off, and it definitely did, because he goes on a killing spree. But we are here to discuss Hosea 11, 1 and 2. And I must say, it certainly feels like for many of the times we've looked at Hosea, we've been reading nothing but negative news, especially for the past several chapters. Israel sinned in just about every way you can imagine. Idolatry, adultery, violence, you name it. So God promised to give them what they justly deserved. They put their trust in people in Hosea 8, and those same people ended up betraying them. They asked other gods for food in chapter 2, and their food supply would be drained of its resources, according to Hosea 9. They sacrificed children to other gods, so the lives of their children would be taken. They abandoned Yahweh, the Lord, and he threatened to leave them. It's been a dark section of Scripture here in the middle part of Hosea, but then we get to verse 1 of chapter 11, and it is a fresh and free breath of gospel air. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Instead of God's law accusing Israel of the sins they've been committing over and over, for a moment, God, through Hosea, reminds Israel about the good and gracious things he had done for them in the past. God had been dealing with Israel, this nation of people who we've been talking about in Hosea, since they were born, or since they've been a child. And it all began when God miraculously gave an elderly couple, Abraham and Sarah, a child named Isaac. That's how God works, by the way. I'm going to start a nation, not with fertile young newlyweds, but with 90-year-olds. And Isaac fathered Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel because he wrestled with God. Jacob's descendants, the children of Israel, ended up in Egypt after a series of unfortunate events, namely a brotherly betrayal where they framed their brother for being killed, and a famine. So they actually end up selling their brother into slavery in Egypt, and then they have to go to Egypt to get food. Now, over the course of 400 years after that in Egypt, these Israelites who had moved there became enslaved. The work was brutal, and the tension was great. Eventually, God had had enough of seeing these people enslaved, so he sent a messenger, Moses, to tell the Pharaoh to let these people go. Well, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, wanted to do things the hard way, and after 10 plagues, God brought Israel out of Egypt and began leading them toward a land he promised to their ancestors. Even though this process took hundreds of years, this was still early on in the history of this nation, and that's why God can say, and that's what he means by, when Israel was a child, still early on, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. It's as if God is reminiscing back to the days when he and Israel were on better terms. And of course, it's not that God is unwilling to help or to save, but Israel has been refusing God's grace. For the majority of this book, God has related himself to Israel as their patient and forgiving husband. But he's also a loving and protective father. However, instead of running to God, they've been running away. Hosea makes it clear that Israel has not been a good wife to Yahweh, just like Gomer was unfaithful to Hosea. These people had been cheating on the Lord. They didn't do so well as God's bride, and they didn't do too good as the children of God either. But this verse, Hosea 11:1, points us in an interesting and unexpected way to the one who would succeed as the Son of God. This is where the Gospel of Matthew comes in, because it applies Hosea 11:1 in a somewhat peculiar yet glorious way. Talking about Joseph and Mary packing up, leaving town, going into Egypt to get away from Herod. And then eventually they have to come out of Egypt to come back into Israel when things are safe. Now, on the surface, this seems like a really strange quotation from Matthew. Hosea 11:1, as we've been talking about, is a clear reference to the Exodus, a past event when God brought Israel, the nation, out of Egypt. But Matthew ties this verse to the moment when Jesus' family took refuge from a hot-headed Herod in Egypt. How do these two events go together? How can Matthew just seemingly pluck this verse out of Hosea and say, yep, that one's about Jesus? Well, for one, the entire Bible, not just the New Testament, is about Jesus. I think about him encountering the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and soon enough explaining to them all the things concerning himself in the law and the prophets, the Old Testament. Jesus walking on this, I think it was a 6-hour walk with them, just explaining the Old Testament and how it all points to him. I mean, could you imagine, like, if you could join any conversation that happened in the Bible, that to me is on the Mount Rushmore of conversations you wish you could have been, not a fly on a wall, but maybe a locust on the dirt path. Just to hear what Jesus said in those hours. But also think about when Jesus was being challenged by the Pharisees, and he told some people, you go to the scriptures because you think in them you have eternal life, but they testify about me. And so if you really believe the Bible, you would believe in me, because the Bible is about me, Jesus says. So Matthew has every right to go to the Old Testament and look for Jesus and find Jesus. Absolutely. But also, God has orchestrated history so that past events predicted what Jesus came to accomplish. You cannot read the New Testament and then the Old Testament and fail to see all the foreshadowing. But there's something else going on here as well. It's not just that the entire Bible tells us about Jesus, generally speaking. And it's not just that there were hundreds of prophecies written about the Christ before he ever lived. Matthew's usage of Hosea 11 helps us realize that Jesus not only came to die for the sins of the world, but he also came to repeat, fulfill, and perfect Israel's history, and human history for that matter. I mean, this verse, Hosea 11:1 and Matthew 2, the way it picks it up, along with others, shows us that Jesus, the Messiah, is in a way all Israel, all humanity reduced down to one person. Like Israel, Jesus had his own exodus from Egypt. That's the connection Matthew makes. But the connections don't stop there. Because according to Paul, when Israel came through the parted Red Sea, that was their baptism. According to 1 Corinthians 10. They were all baptized. And of course, you know, Jesus had his own baptism too. And let's read about it. Matthew 3. Not long after Matthew 2, you'll notice. 13 through 17 says this. Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to John to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? But Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. See, there Jesus here is on the mission to fulfill Israel's history, human history, with all righteousness. To go back through it all and to redo it and to do it right this time. And when Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Perhaps you can make connections to the ark there as well. Peter will connect the flood to baptism. And one similarity is you've got the presence of the usage of the word dove. And so, of course, after the working of the water that God used in the flood, a dove was used by Noah. And here, after Jesus comes up from the water, God descends, the Spirit of God descends like a dove on him. But nevertheless, let's get back to these similarities, because God brought Israel into the wilderness for a time of testing. And we can read this in Deuteronomy, and this might be the most explicit example, but Deuteronomy 8, we'll read 2 and 3. It says, "You shall remember the whole way that Yahweh Elohim has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Israel was brought into the wilderness for a time of testing. Well, guess what? After Jesus was baptized, the Spirit of God led Jesus out into the wilderness where he was tempted or tested. We'll look at the Luke version of this story. In chapter 4, verse 3, the devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread." And Jesus answered him, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone." Jesus pulls from that very example of the Israelites being tested in the wilderness. And Moses says the application was, you're supposed to learn that man does not live by bread alone. And guess what? Jesus knows that perfectly, knows that all well, and that is how he defends himself against the temptations of the devil. So why did Jesus come and redo all of this? Well, people like us, like Abraham, Isaac, and the Israelites, have filled up the timeline of history with sin. Our performance has not been up to God's standards. And have you ever heard the phrase, if you want something done right, do it yourself? Well, that's what's happening when Jesus, the eternal messenger or Word of God, takes on flesh and lives out a perfect life as the Son of God on earth. As a child, just like Israel, Jesus took refuge in Egypt and was brought out of Egypt into safety. And where the children of Israel and the rest of mankind failed as the children of God, Jesus, the Son of God, succeeds in every way. Through his death on the cross, he paid the debt for all of the sins you've ever committed. And through his life, 30 years of withstanding temptation, fulfilling all righteousness, and doing everything God commanded, Jesus now gifts you with a perfect record of obedience before God. See, it's not just that God has given you a blank slate and a second chance. If Jesus came and died for you and said, okay, I've erased your board, here, try again, you'd blow the second chance too. But where Adam and Eve failed, where the nation of Israel failed, where all of us have failed, Jesus has succeeded. And this is why the Christian life is so free, because your righteousness is not something you need to accomplish. God did that for you. And as a believer, that frees you up to stop worrying about whether or not you've done enough, because you haven't. You can stop worrying about yourself and your own performance and start serving others and loving God freely. But Israel during Hosea's time was currently in a period when they did not want gifts from Yahweh. And he points out that ever since they'd been called out of Egypt, this has been the struggle. Verse 2, the more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. After 400 years, several generations of living in Egypt, which was a land with a large lineup of gods, you can imagine how the Israelites' way of worshiping would be heavily influenced by the Egyptians. And even though Israel was out of Egypt, Egypt was not completely out of Israel. The entire story of the Old Testament can basically be boiled down to this. Yahweh helps and pursues Israel, but they pursue and praise false gods. Now, he genuinely calls them back to himself day after day, one prophet after another. And this is one of my favorite verses about this. It comes from Jeremiah 7:25. It says, from the day that your fathers came out of the land of Egypt, back to the Exodus, to this day, I have persistently sent all my servants the prophets to them day after day. Yet they did not listen to me or incline their ear, but stiffened their neck. They did worse than their fathers. The more God called for them, the more they strayed. And that's where we will leave them for now, picking up next time in verse 3.